Welcome back to Connect and Transform. We're picking up right about where we left off and creating a graphing SVG. First, I just want to point out a couple of issues that I noticed. One was in the validate graph function, this section of code here, the intention of which was to say that if graphData.type was not set, then we were going to default it to bar. I forgot the exclamation point preceding graphData, so I've added that in there. Next, let's scroll down. Init y-axis, as far as I know, is done, so let's tab that over. Init x-axis is also essentially done. I'm going to go ahead and tab it over, but there was one issue with it, which is we copied and pasted a lot of this from the y-axis function, and we forgot to update this right here. So when we're setting the x labels class name, we want to make sure that that is x-axis, not y-axis. Next, I noticed that this line is far more complicated than it needs to be, the intention of which was to say that if you have more than 8 but less than 24 x-axis labels, that we want to hide about half of them. So we're going to simplify that by getting rid of all that, and we're just going to say if x modulo 2 equals 1, then we're going to hide it. But we're going to hide it in a different way. We're going to say graphData.x-axis dot labels at position x equals empty string. So we're just going to blank it out that way. And the reason is we took the wrong approach in adding this here, because we're using the variable x to position all of our labels and ticks. So it was just the wrong approach. So what I'm going to do is we're going to close that loop there, and then we're going to open the same loop again. And I feel like we're missing something. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. And then basically we're just going to check here, and we're going to say if the x-axis label at index x is empty, then we're going to skip creating the tick mark or the label, except I want to add a second condition. Personally, I think that if you're dealing with a small graph that has less than, or in this case equal to 8 x-axis labels, I think even if they are blanked out and they're empty, we should be showing the tick mark just so that the graph is easier to read, in my opinion. So that's why I'm adding this second condition here before skipping doing the tick marks or the graph labels. So I believe that is all the fixes to init x-axis. I'm just going to save real quick and refresh this with the console open to make sure that it seems like it works, and it does. So in the last video, looking at the top graph here and looking at the x-axis along the bottom, I was looking at the tick marks and the spacing was correct, so I thought everything was good. But then I started reading the content after I finished the video, and I realized, oh, it's just advancing to the next label, and they're being spaced out so far that they're running way off over to the right over here, and you're just not seeing it because it's off the canvas. But in this case, it is functional both in the spacing of the tick marks and in the actual content that's being shown. The very first x-axis label is the Jan 2017 that we see. The very last is the Jan 2025 that we see. So the content is correct, the spacing is correct, hiding them is having the right effect. So we are done, I believe, with init x-axis. So let's scroll up to the top now, and let's look at this top part of the document. So we do need to add a little bit more styling, and then we need to add some definitions. Let's look at our styling real quick. So we're going to add some defaults to text elements. We're going to add a fill or a color, which is going to be a dark gray. We're going to add some default font families. So we'll have 3 options of fonts so that we're basically guaranteed to find a font that exists on the system. So Helvetica, Verdana, and Arial. And then we'll default the font size to 22 pixels. And then we're going to add a couple of lines for text.x-axis and text.y-axis. And those are going to vary in font size. The y-axis will be 18 pixels, the x-axis 16. And then while we're here, we're also going to target this tooltip text node, and it's going to vary by having a fill of white. And I believe that's all the CSS we have. So for definitions, we're going to have a pattern and a mask, and that's going to be used whenever the work in progress, the WIP flag, is set. So down here at the bottom of the screen, a reminder that this exists. And so the pattern and the mask that we're going to create in the definitions section, that's what's going to get applied and help differentiate past true data from future estimated data. So up here in the definitions, we're going to create a pattern. Inside that pattern is going to be a rectangle. We're going to give the pattern an ID. We're going to call it pattern stripe. And then we're going to give it a width and a height. And then we're going to give it pattern units, the value of which is going to be user space on use. And then we're going to do a pattern transform, telling it to rotate 45 degrees. That way we just get a nice little diagonal hatch. And then the rectangle, we're going to give it a width and a height. We're also going to fill it with white. And that completes our pattern. So now let's build a mask. Our mask is going to also contain a rectangle which will have an ID. And this ID is going to be diagonal hatch actually, no, it's the mask will have the ID. The rectangle gets pulled in. So the rectangle in the mask is going to have a width and a height and a fill. Width and height 100%. The fill is going to be a reference to pattern stripe. So we'll have a mask that is filled with a pattern. And then we're going to add a couple of linear gradients. So imagine you have a line chart where the data greatly exceeds the capacity of the y-axis. And imagine the top, or a bar chart, whatever. Imagine the bar is extending beyond the very top of the graphical area. It might run into the series labels. So we want to, that's part of why we're calling init series labels after init data, is we want the labels to show up over the data. So these linear gradients are going to help kind of fill in the space between the series labels and the data. It will allow us to read it more easily. We're going to give this an ID. We're going to call it top mask. And it's going to contain an x1, a y1, an x2, and a y2. And these are going to control essentially the start and end points of our gradient. So for x, we're just going to say 50% and 50%. But we want it to vary across the y-axis, so that's going to be 0% going to 100%. And I'm going to copy this for the second linear gradient we'll get to in a moment. We're going to have some stop elements inside our linear gradient. They're going to have an offset with some percentage. And then it's going to have a stop color and a stop opacity. Okay, so from 0 to, let's say, 60%, we want it to be fully opaque. We don't want it to be transparent, and we want it to be white. So stop opacity will be 1, and then from 60 to 100%, we want to graduate it to an opacity of 0, and for the color, we'll just keep it the same. And I'm just going to copy that into our second gradient. So the purpose of this second gradient is the same as the first, except this is the case where you might have series labels running onto two different lines. So we'll call this one top mask multi-line. The x's and y's can stay the same because it's still just a gradient vertically. We're going to modify this a little bit though, so from 0 to 90% will be fully opaque, and then from 90 to 100 we will very quickly become fully transparent. So that's it for the linear gradients. Let me do a quick save, and I'm going to refresh and make sure I don't have any obvious typos. So let's scroll down and scan, looking for things that are all the way on the left. So we need to scale the y-axis. We need to initialize series labels. And then we have a bunch of data-related functions, some tooltip functions, and some formatting functions. One thing I'm noticing is we're not going to use this function here, bar stacked. Instead, we're going to use initData bar function with stacked as a parameter, and that's also going to be true for area and for line. I think while we're here, I'm going to go ahead and create the initData function because it is just a delegator. All it does is call other functions. So we'll say if graphData.type. Now remember that in the validate graphData function, we've already lowercased this. So if that equals area, then we're going to call this. And I'm just not going to pass a parameter in. I could also pass something like false. Same behavior. Alternatively, the type might be area-stacked, in which case we're going to call the area function passing a true parameter. So let's add a couple more conditions for bar and bar-stacked, which will each call the bar-related function either with or without the stacked flag. And then likewise, we'll do the same thing for lines. And then finally, we will do scatter. Okay, so that finishes the initData function. And I think we're going to end the video there, and we will pick up in another one. Thank you for watching.